There are many different ways of invoicing within Office Tools Workspace. During this video, we're going to be focusing on reoccurring invoicing. Reoccurring invoicing within the context of Workspace is when you charge your client a set amount on a set schedule. Because both of those things are set, we can create an automatic invoice that generates on that cycle that you've set up with your client. For example, if you charge Balboa Flower Shop Incorporated $250 a month, you can set that up in Office Tools so that every month an invoice is automatically generated for you and plugged in as AR within the system. Another benefit of using recurring invoicing, aside from it creating that invoice every month, is that it will also, based off of parameters that you set, go in and grab work in process and associate it with that invoiced amount. And you can clarify which types of work codes you'd like to include in that flat rate amount. To set up a recurring invoice, simply navigate to the Billing tab located at the top of the screen here. Make sure that you have the Invoices button selected, and then click on the Reoccurring button in the toolbar here. Now, one thing to note is that you do not have to worry about which contact you have selected on the left-hand side. You simply just need to click on the Reoccurring button. Once here, you'll have a list of all of the contacts that you have on a recurring invoicing cycle. You'll be able to see when their next invoice is, how often you invoice them, and how much you invoice every time. You can also turn on or off your recurring invoices by selecting the box located here. So in this example, we see that ABC Company is billed once a month for $200. To set up a new recurring invoice, you're simply going to navigate to the button that says New in the bottom left, and that pulls open the Add Recurring Invoice screen. Within this screen, you're going to give all of the details of this invoice to Office Tools so that it generates the appropriate invoice on the given cycle. Here, the very first thing that you're going to want to select is the contact that you want to set up. In this case, we're going to create one for Balboa Flower Shop. If you wanted to select a different client, simply drop the menu down and start typing. The next thing that we want to set up are the invoice types, the level of detail, and the invoice status that will be the default for the invoice that we're creating. The invoice type, in most cases, is going to be summary invoice. That way, you can customize a description based off of the exact services that you're charging the client for using this recurring invoice. The level of detail should also typically read summary detail, and the invoice status in most cases is going to be final. Now you can adjust these to your liking, but this is the default that we recommend. Once you've selected all three fields, you're going to navigate to the summary invoice description and actually type in what you want to show on the invoice itself. In this case, we'll plug in a basic description and we're finished. Now, you do have the ability to insert merge fields if you have date-sensitive information. The merge fields are located here and allow you to plug in a formula that calculates a date based off of when the invoice is created. The detail section located here is where we'll populate in all of the intricate details of the invoice itself. Your starting date is going to be the day in which you start the work that you're charging this client for using this recurring invoice. In the scenario that you're using WIP and associating that time to this invoice, this date is going to be when it goes back to and stops looking for time. So in this scenario, we're going to populate in the 1st of April. The next option that we have says time to next invoice. And what this is your interval that you're charging the client on. If it's a monthly invoice, you're going to populate in the first box here, 1, and then in the second, you're going to choose months. The amount of each invoice is where you populate in how much you're charging the client. And the number of invoices to create is going to be how many invoices this little mini program creates before it turns off. Most offices will plug in a large number here. That way, it's going to run until it's either edited or deleted. The next invoice date is going to be the date in which we invoice the client next. So we want to populate in here the next invoice that we want to create. In this scenario, we're going to populate in the 15th. So now, based off of the rules that we have populated in here, we have an invoice that's going to be created once a month for $250 until we turn it off effectively. And the next invoice that needs to be created is an invoice for $415. Once that invoice has been created, every month on the 15th, a new reoccurring invoice will be ready to be created. The item code that we see here will allow you to sync up to QuickBooks if you're using that component. This item code will be linked up to a service item in QuickBooks, and the revenue generated from this invoice will be sent to that service item. The auto add expense items to an invoice allows you to choose some pieces of information to add a flat rate that's non-time based to your invoice, whether that be a monthly FedEx charge or an annual subscription fee, something along those lines where it isn't time based but you're still charging the client for it. You'll use the expense items section here to add that fee. Simply check the box, pick a work code, add in any notes that are pertinent, and then go down to the add expense items section here and plug in the actual fee that you want to charge on this invoice every month or on whatever cycle you have set up. If it's a computer charge, for example, choose the computer charge expense code. Then set your fixed amount or set your percentage of the invoice total so that Workspace knows exactly how much to charge on each invoice. Once you've populated that in, go ahead and key in a note and click OK. Now that item will be added to your invoice when it's created. The most important part of setting up a recurring invoice happens here with the WIP. WIP is work in process. Another term for that is unbilled billable time. And in most cases, it's going to be beneficial to track billable time, even if you're flat rate billing or charging a client on a recurring interval. To incorporate that time into this invoice, we're going to select the box here that says include following WIP as part of flat rate amount. Next, we want to go to the ellipsis button located on the far right hand side of the work code option so that we can select any work code that we would like to automatically populate into this invoice. Since our invoice here is for general accounting services, we're going to choose in the list on the left all of our accounting work codes. We'll say that bookkeeping is also part of that, and maybe the payroll processing component as well. You can select as many or as few work codes as needed to ensure that any time that gets associated to this invoice is for the billed amount. Once you have all the time selected here, go ahead and click Close at the bottom, and you'll notice that in your work code field now it says Collection, which signifies that we've selected more than one work code as part of this recurring invoice. Now you can also select a project right underneath the work code here, so that time has to be associated to one of those work codes and one of those projects. But please note that this is not an or, this is an and, which means that time will have to be associated to both a work code and a project in order to be relieved by this recurring invoice. If it is only associated to one, it will not be included. It is highly recommended that you do not use the project field and just focus on the work code field. The last option that you see in this screen says include remaining WIP as additional invoice line items. If such WIP exists, wait 0 days to create invoice. What this means and what this gives you the ability to do is take any other WIP outside of what you've selected above and associate that to the invoice as well. However, that time will affect the invoiced amount, which means that your invoice will go up from what you have selected on the far left-hand side here. It will only go up based off of the amount of time that's associated outside of the work codes that you already have selected, but that invoice total will go up. If you would like to have that option selected, you can also delay the creation of this invoice based off of a certain number of days. You would do that using this option here and plug in how many days you would like to wait to create this invoice. Now, please note that because we recommend using a summary style invoice and a summary detail invoice, this option typically does not work, and you should probably invoice any remaining time on a separate bill. Once all of this information has been keyed in, your reoccurring invoice has been set up, click OK, and we'll see that Balboa Flower Shop is now included in the list of reoccurring invoices. We can see that it's enabled. We can see that it's a $250 invoice that's going to be created once a month, and the next invoice that needs to be created is for April 15th. At this point, you can add another reoccurring invoice or close this window out, and you're done. The best part about the reoccurring invoicing section is that you do not have to manually create those invoices. To show you what happens, I'm going to go ahead and close down Office Tools, and I'm going to reopen it. When a reoccurring invoice hits that next invoice date and we log into the system, we'll notice a prompt that pops up that asks us if we would like to create the recurring invoices that we have set up that are ready to go. If an invoice has not hit the next invoice date, you will not be able to create it until that specific date. You cannot create it earlier. Now, you can create it later. The next prompt that we have here says there are recurring invoices that are due to be created. Do you want to create them now? This prompt will pop up again anytime an invoice hits that next invoice date, automatically. If we click no, the creation will be delayed until we do click yes. But if we click yes, it's going to pop up with a list of the invoices that are ready to go, and we can then select exactly who we want to create invoices for. Once we've selected that, we're just going to click create, and it's going to go through automatically and create invoices for every single contact that we have selected. It notifies us when it's completed. We click OK. We click close. And if we go to Balboa Flower Shop and go to the billing tab and head to the invoices button here, we'll notice that now there's an invoice for $250 for April 15th, and it's in final status.